Buenos dias. Good
Buenos
morning.
dias.
My name is Peter Casarella. I'm the Director of Latin American and North American Church Concerns, and it's a great pleasure for me to greet you this morning, those of you who are assembled here in the basement of Geddes Hall, and also those of you in the Notre Dame community who are joining us through the Notre Dame channel. We're here, as you know, this morning to witness through live streaming the beatification of Father Stanley Rother. It's a great privilege as director of LNOC to co-sponsor this event with the McGrath Institute for Church Life. And in that regard, I'd like to thank John Cavadini, Valerie McCants, and the entire staff of the McGrath Institute for their generous hospitality in allowing us to use these facilities, and of course in helping Guadalupe Ramirez and myself in the organization and planning of this marvelous event. Father Rother was a martyr of the church, and today we will be witnesses to the official recognition of his martyrdom by the Holy Father and by the people of God. Martyria means offering yourself as a witness to Christ. Father Rother did this in a unique way. He's not only the first person born in the United States to be officially recognized as a martyr, but he's a typically American priest who led an untypical form of ministry for an American priest. Part of the uniqueness of his witness has to do with the evangelical powerfulness and the compelling nature of the witness. The other part, of course, has to do with the bond that he, as a child of the American Midwest, made with the indigenous people in Latin America. Father Rother was a man who built bridges between peoples rather than walls that separate peoples. It's my great privilege to introduce you to the person who's going to introduce us to Father Rother, and that is Father Robert Pelton, CSC. Father Bob is the Director Emeritus of LNOC and literally a living legend. Tara Hunt McMullen's article, Truth to Power, in the spring 2017 issue of Notre Dame Magazine, and we have a couple copies back there if you'd like to take one home, documents his legendary status very eloquently. In presenting to you a legend of Notre Dame, I'm going to limit myself to 3 facts. First, Father Bob graduated from Notre Dame in 1945 and joined the 49ers, the seminary class of 1949. In addition to being one of a number of illustrious 49ers and a highly regarded swim coach, he's also the oldest living member of the Notre Dame Glee Club. Second, Father Bob started the Romero Days in 1985. 5 years after the assassination of Blessed Archbishop Oscar Romero in El Salvador. Notre Dame's Romero Days Conference is the oldest continuing memorial to the Blessed Oscar Romero that I know of at any academic institution in the world. And we will continue this tradition on March 24th, 2018 with a Mass in the Basilica. And finally, like Father Stanley Rother, Father Bob has been a missionary in Latin America, in Chile, in Cuba, in El Salvador, and in Panama. No one at Notre Dame, not even Father Ted Hesburgh, has done as much as Father Bob in making folks at Notre Dame aware of the preferential option for the poor, of base ecclesial communities, and of their model of the church, and of the need to bring the idea of missionary discipleship from Latin America back to the United States. Like Father Rother, Father Bob is an actual embodied history-making paradigm of mission in reverse. He took what he learned about missionary discipleship and brought it to us here at Notre Dame. And he's doing that again this morning as he introduces you to the life of Father Stanley. Father Bob.
Thank you very much, Peter. It's a pleasure to be with you, to know this can be shared and will be shared with many others through the stream of television today. I also would like to thank very much Brother Jim Miller of Holy Cross House and about 35 ministers over at Holy Cross House from various parts of the world who have given long years of service to the church in various continents of our world. I'd like to share with you briefly this morning about the courageous U.S. priest from Oklahoma and the modest efforts of the University of Notre Dame to support inter-American church efforts, such as we're enjoying this morning. Stanley was the first U.S.-born martyr to be beatified, and he is an Oklahoma gentleman who served as a priest in Guatemala for 13 years, and he is being beatified later today, and we'll see it on television, and he's going to be the first recognized martyr to have been born in the United States. And before highlighting his life and works, allow me to insert a little of Notre Dame background. In 1960, I had collaborated with Father John Considine of Maryknoll to promote a greater interest in the Latin American church through the Department of Theology, a course on inter-American relations. It was Considine who first suggested to the Vatican that religious from the United States and Canada especially should go to Latin America, and he, more than anyone else, shaped and focused the attitudes and activities of missionaries with his three-part theory of mission: the intensive positioning and preparing of religions to serve, and secondly, his encouraging community to be a strong part of the educational process, and thirdly, to promote strong solidarity with the local people. And to think that this was going to be accomplished easily would be a mistake. It took a long time and lots of suffering to position what could be of service to the folk of Latin America in ways that they were requesting, rather than ways that we thought were the manners to do it. 1961, Pope John the 23rd, now the saint, called for 10% of North American religious and priests to go to Latin America by the end of the decade. This call was relayed to the United States by Monsignor Agostino Casaroli. And speaking in the name of the Vatican Commission for Latin America, Casaroli chose Notre Dame to announce the appeal. And almost the goal that they thought they would achieve was not to be accomplished of 10%. On the other hand, the invitation did spark commitments to serve in Latin America from a large number of priests, sisters, and brothers. And eventually, I don't mean right away, eventually what this led into was people that finally found their position and their way of service in that important area of the world. This did not come easily. There was reactions which criticized people who feared the North Americanization of the Latin American church. Casaroli's desire for matching candidates for this type of ministry took time and many years of work. And at the beginning, many critics had good reasons. On the other hand, there were many people who came with presuppositions as to how to carry on the mission and respond to the invitation. Eventually, this was worked through, and it was much later that there was to begin what we would call a type of reverse mission to the church in Latin America. At Notre Dame's theology department, where at that moment I happened to be chair, I was unable to accept Casaroli's request immediately, but I heard it in person. I was moved by his presentation, and I had also earlier on taken a vow of being willing to serve anywhere in the world that my superior general might call me to. This vow assisted me in the acceptance of the assignment to Latin America in 1963, which proved to be one of the most positive opportunities in my whole pastoral life. So I went to Chile in 1964, By contrast, Stanley Rother was still in the seminary, and his advancement to ordination was being severely questioned. Both of us would soon be immersed in the pastoral activities of Latin America. Stanley Rother exclusively in Guatemala, myself principally in Chile, but also continuing on in other areas of Latin America. This morning, the reason we're here is to honor Father Rother as he will become beatified for his historic witness to the gospel. And so both of us, in our own ways, have been part of a modest response, my own included, and his in a heroic way, to the pastoral needs of the Latin American church. I'd like to say a few observations about the early history of Stanley Rother. He came from a small town of Ocache in Oklahoma, where his parish, his Catholic school, his family, farm, were the pillars of his life. There were fine priests who were models for his desire to become a priest. And after his graduation from high school, Stanley desired to enter a seminary. And despite his desire to become a priest, which had begun in 1957, Stanley had academic challenges to the classes in San Antonio's major Assumption Seminary. He had particular difficulty in learning Latin. He had to take over his course year in philosophy again. He failed. Therefore, he was asked to drop out of the seminary. In hearing of these struggles of Stanley, Sister Clarissa Tenbrick, his fifth grade teacher, wrote to him to offer her encouragement, reminding him that the sainted Curé of Ars also had real difficulties with his seminary studies, but that he had persevered. In the midst of this, Stanley was quiet-spoken, not an aggressive person, and this was his lifelong trait. And just 2 weeks before his murder, he said that he could use a course in assertiveness training. And as we shall see, at the time of the death of his own being murdered, he did assert himself to save his beloved indigenous. Returning to his continuing desire to become a priest, it was decided that Bishop John Reed, his local ordinary, ought to be approached for assistance, and therefore arrangements were made to include Stanley's pastor, Father Van Elm, his father, to meet with the bishop. The bishop asked Stanley, "Do you still want to become a priest?" And Stanley said, it looks like it's all over for me. And then what happened, Bishop Reed said, "No, it isn't. It's not my smart priests who are necessarily my best priests." And so Reed arranged for a second opportunity for Stanley at Mount St. Mary's in Maryland. And this time he did better, and he was ordained May 25th, 1963. He had grown in maturity, but he still was Joseph the worker. He was a farm boy that when he wasn't in the classroom, he was out there fixing up the library, the buildings, whatever were called for. He was a kind of St. Joseph in that sense. And at the same time, he had, however, grown in maturity. He did see that God had prepared him for a deep commitment, and so that he committed himself in 1968 to the Guatemalan mission in the Mayan culture of Guatemala. And direct contact is what gave him the focus and the purpose to his life. The immersion of Stanley into a different culture was something very special. And while Guatemala is only the size of Ohio, it has a special variety in its landscape. And the Indian culture there attracts many visitors. And these visitors come to see the Mayan ruins of Taikai, that are found in a flourishing rainforest, the northern province of Pelton. And in the west of the nation, there are rows of volcanoes interspersed with lakes that regularly change color. Around Pelton, the mission of Stanley was that there is here a lake that is sacred to the indigenous. And there were, even in his time, inns springing up around the lake. And in the capital, Guatemala City, today, there are modern hotels decorated with different indigenous motifs. Many tourists visit this due to the beauty of the country, the attractiveness of the main art and decorations. However, these tourists rarely experience the political terrorism of the country. And whenever the tourists are present, the terrorists, usually the military, avoids them. But the ongoing poverty of most Guatemalans is hard to avoid. In some 500 years after the Spanish conquest, Guatemalan Indians survived more as a race and a culture than do most of the indigenous of the Americas. These Mayans are attached to their land and to the corn that they grow. And this was the culture that Stanley entered into for 13 years of ministry. It was there that he began to master 2 Mayan languages, to preach in that language, a challenging dialect. He was called Padre Apla, his name in the Mayan dialect. This is the fellow who flunked Latin and had to redo a year of philosophy in the major seminary in San Antonio. But as he became deeply immersed in this various and different culture, he entered freely into the indigenous liturgical practices. When the Guatemalan mission arrived there had not been a priest for 100 years, quite different from Peru. And so this was one of the issues of where people were asking for help. And Guatemala was a very appropriate place. He also began to intuit people, even government spies, the orejas, the ears of these folk who were reporting back to the government. And these spies, the ears of opposition within his mission were evident to him. He wasn't naive. He may not have studied carefully the writings of the rising stars of the European theology, but he did intuit well the people he served and how to adapt the liturgy in ways that were appropriate. And so this kind of leads into a brief observation about the fortitude, the pastoral fortitude of Stanley, which is quite evident. In January 1981, in grave danger, Stanley, having seen his name on the death list, decided to return to Oklahoma, and his bishop advised him to do this, to spend time with his family. And he was there, and he thought it over, he prayed it seriously, and he decided, I cannot abandon my people, and ultimately he was killed for acting out his Catholic faith. Stanley was quiet-spoken, rarely assertive. This changed rapidly on July the 28th, 1981. And this is when he had decided to come back to be of service to his indigenous during Holy Week and to stay with them till he was to give his life for them. These 3 persons on July the 28th, non-indigenous, planned to disappear him as they'd already done with 9 priests and hundreds of teachers at the mission. He did not call for help for the same reason. He fought for approximately 15 minutes with the intruders, and at the same time, they finally shot him twice, and within that period of time, he'd offered his life for them. So he certainly showed that when the moment of truth arrived, that he could be pastorally assertive. His body is buried in the Holy Trinity Seminary in his hometown of Oklahoma, but the indigenous people insisted that his heart be left with them. And they placed his heart and blood behind the church's altar right there where he had served the indigenous. This was appropriate, since this is where his heart was, clearly with the people. And before expressing the signature prayer of Father Stanley, I wish to point out that Pope Francis now is emphasizing the importance of the indigenous people in Latin America. And last year, when he visited Chiapas, Mexico, it was evident that the Bishop Luis Ruiz had done similar work earlier with the indigenous in Chiapas, which, by the way, has suffered terribly in the recent earthquake in Mexico. I'd like to say that I have visited Chiapas. Bishop Ruiz came here at Notre Dame, and his importance to us indicated the leadership that we're called to exert in relationship to these people of Latin America. And before expressing the signature prayer of Stanley Rother, let me just say that this prayer expresses the heart of what we have to say about him. He says that the shepherd cannot run at the first sign of danger. Pray for us that we may be a sign of love of Christ for our people, that our presence among them will fortify them to endure sufferings in preparation for the coming of the kingdom. I would like to say that we too, if we look at the reality of our world at this moment, if we look at the challenges to our church through its gospel, that we also are called to be signs of love for Christ in the present challenges in our own suffering world and society. What I'd like to do now, if I may, is to just briefly share with you about the sources that one could use to find out more clearly, more definitely, what this mission is, not only of Stanley, but to the indigenous of the Americas, including the United States. The first would be this book of Maria Ruiz Scapolanda, The Shepherd Who Didn't Run, Father Stanley Rother from Oklahoma. This is, at the present time, the most authoritative text in regard to Stanley. The book of the Orbis publishers of 1988, Donna and Edward Brett, Murdered in Central America, the story of 11 U.S. missionaries, has one chapter about Stanley Rother. And this chapter was presented 1 year before the publication of the book here at Notre Dame. And then also we have the papers of Professor Charles Kinney of the University of Oklahoma, PhD in political science from the University of Notre Dame. And also he has served with Holy Cross in the earlier years in Peru. And he was kind enough to give his whole file of references to this great person about to be beatified in a little while. We have that file, which is of great help for people who will be researching more deeply. Robert Horteau put out from Marino Publishers in 2013 a book about John Constantine, and that book clearly takes up the pros and the cons that the U.S. Church itself had to work through, and it is moved into another place, so that now we find ourselves into a position of recognizing what we call the reverse mission. What does Latin America have to offer us in a continuing way in terms of intellectual dimensions and the pastoral aspects of the U.S. Catholic Church? That series of publications which was sponsored by the Secretariat of the U.S. Catholic Bishops, and which we coordinated from Notre Dame, was a 2-year study. All of these, both in Spanish and English, and documentaries, are available at the U.S. Catholic Conference. So I think that we do have now an opportunity for anybody who may wish to ask questions or observations, expressions, that I'm certainly open to them and happy to accommodate your needs. I'll just say a couple words before any people might wish to ask a question or two, and that would be that in the Mass which will be following beatification, and this will be linked into it 10:45 this morning, in the Mass itself, the first part of the Mass, which is ordinarily where we have the penitential rite, that is where there will be the actual document presented about the beatification of Romero. And then it'll be Mass that will continue. It'll be interesting to see in this celebration, which will probably go on from about 11 to 1, if I'm judging correctly from the Beatification Mass of Oscar Romero, that you'll find that there will be many priests there with red stoles on, being of martyrdom. You'll also see the fact that the influence of the indigenous culture, and I'm kind of anxious to see how much of that they will be able to bring in. And I would say, lastly, why preparing for anybody who wants to make an observation, that the importance of this ceremony and the importance of this, what we are about to witness, is extraordinarily significant for the U.S. Catholic Church, providing an opportunity for us to really enter more deeply into a real commitment to the gospel in ways that are concrete and ways that are counterproductive, and give a different type of testimony that is present all over our world at this suffering moment. Observations or questions?
We have about 15 minutes for questions, if anyone wants to ask a question. If not, I can get us started. Father Bob, you talked to some people from Oklahoma City, some people here at Notre Dame. Our own bishop is down in Oklahoma City. Could you tell us a little bit about that? What are the connections between Notre Dame and what's going on in Oklahoma City today?
Yes, the connection with the connections really. One aspect of the commission is that our own local ordinary actually is down there with a team of communications persons of the Diocese of Fort Wayne South Bend, because of the fact that he had been rector of this Assumption Seminary at an earlier moment, and he's very proud that a graduate from that seminary is being beatified. I think that's one connection. I think another thing is, I don't know, the woman who published this book, The Shepherd Who Didn't Run, a book from our Sunday Visitor Press.
Which is on sale outside.
And this was turned down for publication. And finally, I'm not sure who intervened, but I think it was our own bishop who did, to say, look, this is very, very important. I think the uniqueness of this, what a kind of ordinary, fine person Rother was, Padre Apla, but at the same time that if he can do it, maybe some of us could do it. But we're all called to it in our way. And I think the other relationship that you, I think, implied is we have a grandniece of Stanley, who's in her first year at Notre Dame, and she's living in Walsh Hall, and she's come over to visit with me. And today she went with her parents down to Oklahoma City to be present at the beatification service. Lovely young woman, and So I think she'll be one of the ones who will light a few fires around here. And we will welcome those fires, even if they become huge fires.
Other comments, questions?
Yes, sir.
Pete. We need to get you
Morning. I was wondering if you might say a bit about what this means in American Catholic history, what this beatification would mean for the American Catholic Church, globally too. We don't have many martyrs beatified. What would it mean to sort of for global Catholicism that he had to go to Guatemala, and what sort of the concept of reverse mission for this moment back into the United States? Thank you.
In response to your observation, what I would say is number one would be the example of leadership of Francisco, our Pope, in terms of when he visited the United States, the first time he was to speak in English, and he touched the nerves of many people in regard to the issues that he brought up about us. And I think that is definitely a door opener, not only in terms of the U.S., but also what he's continued to do, like with the Cuban relationships, with Colombia last week, and Peter is quoted in the international press about his role in Colombia. And I think that's followed through. We are called to be to really swim against the stream. I think we are a little bit too close to being fat and sassy, and that doesn't work with the real gospel. And so I think we're being called to appropriately assert ourselves, as did Romero at the time of his death. And just like for Rother, it was tough, because he was not one of these people that would get riled up too much, but he did become riled up in terms of his style of service. That we're called to a sharper sense of prophecy of the U.S. Catholic Church than is being exemplified right now, and can't just blame it on the bishops. And so I think that we have a responsibility that we're called to assume. And I hope and pray that we will.
Any follow-up on that? Anybody else? So I'll ask another question, Father Bob, then. Rother was clearly evangelized by the indigenous, by the Mayan people who met in Guatemala. But how does that, you kind of intimated this, but could you say more about how that compares with your own experience going down to Chile, for example? I mean, what was your experience of being evangelized, particularly with the Pinochet regime and all that?
My experience in Chile was analogically parallel to Rother, in the sense that Rother was intelligent, but he sometimes was seen as kind of conservative in regards to the great theologians like Congar or Léger, people like that of France, the Northern European theologians, which were very influential and still have a role to play. But the thing is that Rother cut through that, and when you see the way, what he did, he intuited. We just had the Pope say, okay, national conferences of bishops are to have the last word now in regard to liturgical expression that's appropriate for them in their countries. And the point that I'm trying to make a parallel here is that when Rother would enter into liturgy with the indigenous, they had certain things that they developed that were meaningful for him, and which would now, at the current time, would not be accepted in liturgical commissions in various dioceses. And yet what he was doing, he was intuiting what was meaningful for them, respecting the essence of what the worship was about in terms of a sacrifice of the Mass. And so he was way ahead of other people in regard to that. He wasn't just fashionable in terms of, like in early Chile in my years, for me, I got turned inside out by that country, by its style of leadership at that time, was the fact that when you'd go to the pastoral meetings in the first years I arrived there, it was taken for granted that you understood French because the experts who would be there would be people like Congar, Liège, other people like that. That was pretty sophisticated. So you had to have understanding and speaking knowledge of at least one of those languages. That was a little different from what we often experience up here, at least at that moment in history. So I think we're called in different ways. And for me, I just have to sit back and say that once one enters into a real conversion experience and you really let it happen, you're never the same. I think there's a little coffee out there.
I have one more question, though.
Oh, yeah.
So John the 23rd said 10% of the religious should go to Latin America, and Pope Francis has talked about missionary discipleship. What is your message to the Notre Dame undergrads and the other young people regarding interchurch cooperation, regarding Latin America?
Yeah, my mission to our undergraduates, they are great youngsters. A number of them really enter into the reality of their own country through the Center for Social Concerns. And I think that's very important. And I admire what has been done, is being done. But I think we have to need to relate that to an even deeper spiritual awareness of our Catholic tradition. And we don't have the one without the other. But if we have them both put together, which is extraordinarily a challenge in our times, we have a great opportunity for Notre Dame students. I know that one of the bishops who will be coming through here, who makes it a point always to celebrate liturgy on Sundays at 10 o'clock with the students when he's here, and at the same time, he sees a potential but needs to be actualized. And what I'm talking about is an ongoing and even stronger relationship between the gospel itself and how this gives birth to the commitment of justice, such as I think Father Don McNeil did such a great mission in opening up the minds of our students. But we're still in process. As one of the great singers used to sing, we've only just begun. I won't sing that for you, but you know who she is.
I wish you would.
Yeah.
So for those of you who are joining us through the Notre Dame channel, I want to thank you very much for being with us today. And I'd like everyone here to please join me in thanking Father Bob Pelton, 96 years young, for this very fresh witness to the gospel and to Father Stanley.
Thank you.